Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. The voice was sharp, wielded like a freshly issued blade. It belonged to Lieutenant Isabella Reyes, whose uniform was so crisp it seemed to defy the humid morning air. She stood, arms crossed, beside the hulking frame of Sergeant Ben Corbin as he physically blocked the path. His thick fingers were wrapped around the delicate upper arm of a 70-year-old woman. But as he tightened his grip on her worn beige cardigan, he had no idea he was touching a living piece of classified history. Before I tell you what they saw under that sleeve, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The sun beat down on the Patriot Command Academy's immaculate parade grounds, a sea of proud families and gleaming brass. The air hummed with anticipation. Thousands of guests, dressed in their Sunday best, filled the stands, their faces beaming with pride. On the vast green field, perfect rows of cadets stood like statues in their dress gray uniforms, a testament to years of discipline. For Eleanor Vance, the 70-year-old woman in the simple floral dress and faded cardigan, it was the culmination of a lifetime of hope. Her grandson, Leo, was out there, third row from the front. She'd driven 9 hours to witness this moment, a legacy she had quietly helped inspire. She held up her ticket, the paper slightly curled from her nervous grip. "I just want to get a little closer," she said, her voice soft but clear. "My eyes aren't what they used to be." Lieutenant Reyes glanced at the ticket with practiced dismissiveness. "This is a general admission ticket, ma'am. That seating is over there." She gestured with a perfectly manicured hand toward a set of distant, sun-scorched bleachers. Sergeant Corbin, a man who seemed to relish the simple authority of his post, added a condescending smile. "You seem to have gotten lost, sweetheart. This area is reserved for distinguished guests." The word sweetheart dripped with false chivalry, a verbal pat on the head for a confused old woman. Eleanor's calm gaze never wavered. She looked past them, toward the field where her grandson stood on the cusp of his future. She wasn't confused. She was determined. "I understand," she said patiently, "but those seats are too far. Is there any possibility of just standing here by the railing for a moment?" The request was met with a shared look of exasperation between the two officers. They were the gatekeepers, the enforcers of order, and this quiet, persistent grandmother was disrupting their perfect system. The line of arriving guests was beginning to swell behind them, their curious glances turning the private disagreement into a public spectacle. "Ma'am, the rules exist for a reason," Reyes stated, her tone shifting from authoritative to patronizing, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "We need to keep these walkways clear for the official party. If you'll please move along, we can avoid any unpleasantness." Eleanor didn't move. It wasn't defiance, not yet. It was the quiet refusal of a woman who had faced down far worse than bureaucratic rigidity. She had earned her place in the world not with wealth or status, but with courage and sacrifice in shadowed corners of the globe the world had forgotten. She wasn't about to be shooed away like a stray cat from one of the proudest moments of her life. The murmur of the crowd grew louder. People slowed, their interest piqued by the quiet standoff. A man in a crisp suit muttered to his wife, "Just let the poor old lady through." A woman shook her head in disapproval. The tension coiled tighter. Seeing the shifting sentiment of the crowd, Reyes's professionalism began to fray, replaced by defensive anger. "Sir," she said, nodding to Corbin, her voice now sharp and loud for all to hear. "This woman is refusing to comply with a lawful order. It's time to escort her from the premises." Corbin's expression hardened. He took a step forward, his bulk intentionally imposing. "Listen, Grandma," he said, his voice a low growl. "You can walk to those bleachers, or we can walk you right off this base. The choice is yours." Eleanor looked at their young, unyielding faces and saw a complete absence of understanding. They saw a frail, stubborn senior who didn't follow directions. They didn't see the woman who had once held the fate of an entire company in her hands, whose calm under pressure was legendary in circles so secret they didn't officially exist. "My grandson is out there," she repeated, her voice steady as stone. "I'm not going to the bleachers. That was the final straw. That's it. Reyes declared, her patience snapping. "Sergeant, remove her. She's creating a public disturbance." Corbin's hand clamped down on Eleanor's upper arm. The grip was firm, designed to intimidate and compel. He began to pull her away from the gate, turning her toward the main road. The crowd parted, their whispers turning to stares of pity and shock. It was a small, ugly moment of public humiliation. But as Corbin pulled, the worn sleeve of Eleanor's beige cardigan slid up her forearm. The movement exposed a small patch of wrinkled, weathered skin just below her elbow. And there, faded by decades of sun and time, was a tattoo. A stylized orchid, its delicate petals encircling a single, small star. A few yards away, leaning against a crowd barrier, Staff Sergeant Miller was trying to ignore the growing knot in his stomach. He was on crowd control duty, and he'd been watching the entire exchange with a rising sense of professional shame. He'd seen officers like Reyes before, all academy training and no practical wisdom. He'd seen NCOs like Corbin, who mistook their stripes for a crown. But it was the old woman who held his attention. There was a stillness about her, a complete lack of fear or panic that resonated with something deep in his soldier's soul. He'd seen that look in the eyes of grizzled, old commandos who came to guest lecture, men who had walked through hell and come out the other side. It was the look of someone who had nothing left to prove. Miller was a history buff, a self-confessed military nerd. He spent his off-duty hours buried in declassified documents and obscure historical archives, fascinated by the forgotten stories and unsung heroes of past conflicts. When Corbin grabbed the woman's arm and her sleeve slipped, Miller caught a glimpse of the ink on her skin. He blinked, his mind instantly racing through thousands of pages he had read. He'd seen that symbol only once before in a heavily redacted file about covert operations during a war that was never officially declared. It was a unit spoken of only in whispers, a phantom force known by a code name, Project Ghost Orchid. The unit was a legend, its members recruited for their extraordinary intelligence and nerves of steel. They were ghosts, their records sealed, their sacrifices unacknowledged. The men and women who wore that mark were considered the best of the best, true shadow warriors. A wave of ice-cold dread washed over Staff Sergeant Miller. He knew, with a certainty that made his blood run cold, that Lieutenant Reyes and Sergeant Corbin were not just disrespecting an elderly woman. They were desecrating a living monument. They were manhandling a hero whose real story would make their own service records look like a summer camp newsletter. He was just a staff sergeant. To directly challenge a commissioned officer in public, especially one as rigid as Reyes, was a career-ending move. He could be written up for insubordination, his promotion prospects turned to dust. Yet, to do nothing felt like a betrayal of the very uniform he wore. It felt like sacrilege. His mind raced, searching for a solution. Who could stop this train wreck? The base commander was busy with the ceremony. The guest of honor, a 4-star general, was about to speak. There was only one person on the base with the institutional authority and informal power to cut through the chain of command like a chainsaw through red tape. The command sergeant major. Miller fumbled for his phone, his fingers slick with sweat. He found a number for the CSM's office, a number he had saved for a true, dire emergency. This, he decided, was that emergency. Turning his back to the scene to shield the call, he spoke in a low, urgent whisper. "Sergeant Major, this is Staff Sergeant Miller on the parade deck. I am sorry to bother you, sir, but you need to get to Gate C immediately." There was a pause on the other end, then the gravelly voice of Command Sergeant Major Jackson. "What's the problem, Miller?" "Spill it." "Sir, Lieutenant Reyes and Sergeant Corbin, they're forcibly removing an elderly civilian, a female veteran." "What did she do?" the CSM asked, his tone impatient. "Nothing, Sergeant Major. Absolutely nothing. She was just trying to get a better view of her grandson's graduation." "But sir, that's not the point. I saw something on her arm." Miller took a deep, shaky breath, the next words feeling momentous. "Sir, I think I saw a ghost orchid." The silence that followed was absolute. It stretched for 3 seconds, then 5, then 7. It was a silence so profound, so heavy, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on Miller's chest. When the command sergeant major finally spoke, his voice was transformed. All the casual authority was gone, replaced by a tight, strained tone filled with a terrifying urgency. "Hold your position, Sergeant. Do not let them leave the base with that woman. I don't care what you have to do. Stop them. I'm on my way." Inside the base's stately headquarters, Command Sergeant Major Jackson slammed the phone down onto its cradle with a crack that made his aide jump. Jackson was a man carved from 3 decades of unwavering service, from the deserts of the Middle East to the mountains of Afghanistan. Every line on his face told a story, and right now, his entire being was telling a story of pure, unadulterated alarm. He moved with a speed that defied his age, storming out of his office and down the polished hallway toward the general's temporary suite. He didn't bother knocking on the aide-de-camp's door. He simply burst in, causing the young captain to leap to his feet, mid-sip of coffee. "I need to see the general." "Now," Jackson commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "He's reviewing his speech, Sergeant Major," the captain began, his eyes wide. "He asked not to be disturbed." Jackson cut him off with a glare so potent it could have stopped a tank. "Captain, you can either open that door, or you can explain to the general why I had to walk through it myself. Your choice." The aide's face went pale. He swallowed hard, knocked once on the heavy inner door, and pushed it open. General Robert Hayes, the 4-star commander of the entire region, looked up from his notes, his brow furrowed in deep annoyance at the intrusion. He was a man of immense presence, his dress uniform a constellation of ribbons and medals that charted a legendary career. His posture was perfect, his gaze intense. When he spoke, his voice was a low rumble that commanded attention in any room. "Sergeant Major," he began, his tone laced with ice. "This had better be the most important thing that has happened on this continent today." "It is, sir," Jackson replied, his breathing heavy from his sprint down the hall. "A call from the parade deck. Security detail at Gate C is ejecting an elderly civilian." The general's expression didn't change. He was still annoyed. "And this requires my personal attention. Why?" "The NCO on site identified a tattoo, sir." Jackson paused, letting the weight of the next words fill the room. "An insignia, a ghost orchid." He watched the general's face carefully. "The guest's name is Eleanor Vance." The change was instantaneous and terrifying. The annoyance in General Hayes's eyes vanished, replaced by a flash of stunned disbelief that quickly hardened into a cold, diamond-hard fury. The name, Eleanor Vance, hung in the air like a thunderclap. The ghost, the woman from the Silent Night, the living legend whose entire operational history was a national secret, a hero whose name was spoken only in the most classified of briefings. The general shot to his feet, kicking his heavy oak chair back with such force that it slammed against the wall. The papers on his desk scattered to the floor, forgotten. His face became a mask of controlled rage, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles bulged. He pointed a finger at his pale-faced aide. "Get the car," he ordered, his voice dangerously quiet. "Get the car now." Then he turned his burning gaze to Jackson. "You're with me." The two men moved as one, a storm of purpose and righteous anger about to be unleashed. For Command Sergeant Major Jackson, it was clear a terrible mistake had been made. For General Hayes, it was far more personal. A sacred debt was about to be repaid. Back at Gate C, the situation had reached a boiling point. Staff Sergeant Miller, acting on his gut and the CSM's orders, had physically placed himself in the path of Reyes and Corbin. "Sir, ma'am, I really think there's been a misunderstanding," Miller said, trying to keep his voice level while his heart hammered against his ribs. "Get out of the way, Sergeant," Corbin grunted, trying to shove past him while still holding Eleanor's arm. "With all due respect, I think we should wait for this to be clarified by a senior NCO," Miller insisted, standing his ground like a rock. Lieutenant Reyes stepped forward, her face flushed with fury at this public challenge to her authority. "Are you disobeying a direct order from an officer, Sergeant Miller?" she snapped. "Because my next call is to the military police. This woman is a trespasser, and you are now interfering with her removal." She jabbed a finger toward Eleanor, who stood watching the internal power struggle with a detached, weary calm. "We can settle this in a holding cell." It was a catastrophic overreach, a threat born of arrogance and inexperience. But before Miller could respond, a sound cut through the air, silencing the crowd. It wasn't the wail of an ambulance or the yelp of a police car. It was the deep, authoritative siren of a high-ranking flag officer's escort. A long black command vehicle with 4-star flags mounted on its front fenders came tearing down the road. It screeched to a halt just feet away, its tires smoking on the hot asphalt. The doors flew open. Command Sergeant Major Jackson emerged from the passenger's side, his face a thundercloud. And from the back stepped General Marcus Thorne, his 6'4" frame radiating an aura of pure, unadulterated fury that seemed to chill the summer air. Lieutenant Reyes and Sergeant Corbin froze solid. Their mouths fell open. They snapped to a rigid, trembling attention, their bodies locked with shock and terror. The sudden appearance of a 4-star general at a minor gate dispute was so far beyond the realm of possibility, it felt like a hallucination. General Hayes didn't even give them a passing glance. His eyes, burning with an intense fire, were locked on one person and one person only, Eleanor Vance. He strode forward, his polished boots thudding on the pavement. He stopped directly in front of her. His gaze dropped to her forearm, where the faded tattoo of the orchid and the star was still visible. And then, the general's entire posture transformed. The rage in his eyes softened, replaced by a look of profound, almost reverent respect. His body, which had been coiled with fury, straightened into the most perfect, ramrod-straight position of attention he had ever held. Then, in an act that sent a shockwave of disbelief through every single person watching, General Robert Hayes raised his hand to his brow and rendered a slow, deliberate, perfect salute. He did not salute the lieutenant or the sergeant. He saluted the quiet old woman in the faded cardigan. "Mrs. Vance." The general's voice was thick with emotion, but it carried across the now silent area. "It is an honor, ma'am. A profound honor." The crowd was utterly still, trying to process the impossible scene. A 4-star general, a man who commanded armies, was saluting a civilian he'd just seen being manhandled. Keeping his salute, General Hayes turned his head slightly, his eyes boring into Reyes and Corbin, who looked as if they might collapse. "Do you have any idea who this is?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. They could only shake their heads, their faces ashen. The general lowered his salute, but kept his eyes locked on them. "You stand in the presence of a national hero." In the darkest days of a forgotten conflict, there was a unit that didn't exist. A unit of ghosts. They were called Project Ghost Orchid. He turned his gaze back to Eleanor, but his voice boomed for all to hear. "This is Eleanor Vance. In a battle that has no name, in a place that isn't on any map, then Specialist Vance stayed at her post while her communications bunker was being overrun. She single-handedly broadcast false enemy coordinates for 3 hours, drawing an entire enemy battalion away from the true evacuation point." A collective gasp went through the crowd. She saved every single soul in her unit. 37 operators. One of them was a young, green communications lieutenant, my father. He finally turned his full, wrathful attention on the 2 trembling officers. "You 2 will be in my office at 1,600 hours. You will bring your service records, and you will be prepared to explain to me why you felt it was appropriate to humiliate a recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross." His voice dropped to a lethal whisper. "Your careers are now under my personal review." He then turned back to Eleanor, his expression softening completely. "Eleanor, on behalf of the United States Armed Forces, I apologize." Eleanor Vance simply raised a hand and placed it on the general's arm. "They're just kids, Robert," she said, her voice filled with a grace that was almost heartbreaking. "They're wearing the uniform. They were trying to do their duty. Don't be too hard on them." This story is a powerful reminder that heroes don't always wear shining armor or stand in the spotlight. They are often the quiet ones, the unassuming figures in the background whose faded cardigans hide stories of incredible courage. True strength is not found in a rigid rulebook, but in the quiet dignity of a life lived in service to others. A sacrifice the world may never officially recognize, but can never truly forget. Have you ever misjudged someone based on their appearance? What would you have done if you were that young lieutenant, strictly following the rules you've been taught? Do you think our society gives enough respect to its elderly veterans, especially the women whose stories are so often left untold? We want to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and please be respectful of all opinions. If this story opened your eyes to the heroes walking among us, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about unsung heroes and hidden legends. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that you can never, ever judge a book by its cover. We read every single comment and value every member of this community. More stories about incredible veterans are waiting for you on your screen. Click on one of those next to keep the journey going, and we'll see you tomorrow with another story that matters.